be starting shortly. We're just organising a couple of drinks. Thank you all for coming at such short notice this evening. We're grateful to Sam Shaheen for making Miko Peled available. We're very grateful for Miko to have agreed to come at short notice for what is an hour session, but I think will be a valuable session. The Islamic Society of South Australia has been kind enough to give us this hall, also at very short notice. And I'd also just like to mention the organisations that worked together to make this happen tonight. So the Australian Friends of Palestine, the Islamic Society of South Australia, the Adelaide Sisters Association, and supported by the Health Workers for Palestine and Glimmer of Hope. So thank you everybody for that. My name is Mike Kazam. I'm with the Australian Friends of Palestine, and I'm very pleased to be doing a conversation this evening with Miko Peled. Miko is well known to a number of you. He's been a peace activist and a critic of the Israeli government and its policies for many, many years. Miko is somebody who went through the Israeli military. He's the son of an Israeli general who became an advocate and a campaigner for peace between Israel and Palestine, and he himself has devoted his life to getting peace and getting justice for Palestinians and peace between Israelis and Palestinians. He's in Australia only for a very short period of time, and we're very pleased to have him here tonight. Miko, welcome to Adelaide.
Thank you. Good to be here. It's working okay.
Like people around the world, people in Adelaide have been glued to their television sets over the last couple of months and have been increasingly despairing of the situation in Gaza and the horrendous toll that's been exacted on the people of Gaza. This isn't, of course, the first attack on the Gaza Strip, and neither is it the first massive assault by Israel on Palestinian populations, but this current attack on Gaza looks to be as bad, and some people have said worse, than the Nakba of 1948. The death toll has been horrendous, and the barbarity of the attack on a defenceless population has shocked the world, but unfortunately not shocked governments into action. You've been a critic of the Israeli government for many years and an observer of the situation in Palestine, in Israel, for many years. Our governments are accepting the Israeli notion that Israel is engaged in an act of self-defence in respect to the Hamas attack of the 7th of October. Many of us here would say that this is just another episode in a colonial war against the indigenous Palestinian people. From the perspective of your years of activism, how do you see the current conflict?
Well, thank you, and once again, thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to see such a big crowd in such short notice. Well, I think, to be honest, what we saw on October the 7th was a watershed moment. I think it's something that we're all going to remember. Anybody who's involved with Palestine will remember exactly where they were when they heard about October the 7th. And then from that moment on, we started hearing all of these. There's a barrage of myths, a barrage of accusations, a barrage of stories of what may or may not have happened. And I think it's important to keep clear what actually we do know and what we don't know, and to separate the myth from the reality, which is something we need to do on the issue of Palestine all the time. I think the terminology is important. I don't think there's a war between Israel and Gaza. And I don't think there's a war between Israel and any particular Palestinian group. There's a war that's been waged by the Zionist movement, by the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, and this is the latest expression of that. It's been a campaign of genocide and ethnic cleansing. It's a Nakba that, it's not a return of the Nakba, this is part of the Nakba. And so it's important, I think, to frame it that way. And if we were to recap what happened on October the 7th, then I think what is obvious is that, and what we do know, is that, there's a buzzing here. What we saw on October the 7th is we saw a group of Palestinian fighters coming out of one of the poorest and most oppressed areas in the world, and these young fighters were able to completely paralyze the state of Israel for weeks. They came by air on gliders, they came by sea on small boats, and they came over land, crossing the fence. And they managed to occupy half of Palestine. 22 Israeli cities and towns and agricultural communities were taken by the Palestinians, and it took the Israeli military weeks actually, before they were able to take the fighting back into the Gaza Strip. And the state of Israel, like I said, was in a state of paralysis. Israelis did not know what in the world was going on. The government was not functioning. They were not providing any information. The army was nowhere to be seen. The intelligence obviously proved itself to be completely helpless and useless. And if we learn one thing, is that the Israeli military, this legend of the Israeli military, is really nothing but a paper tiger, as is the Israeli intelligence services. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the events of October the 7th took place exactly 50 years and 1 day after October the 6th, 1973, when the October War began. And during that time, again, we saw the Israeli military collapse, the Israeli intelligence services collapse. And what we're seeing is a pattern that every time the Israeli military is actually confronted by a well-trained, well-motivated force, they collapse. They're incapable of facing, serious fighting force. And again, the force that they had to engage with on October the 7th were a group of fighters from one of the poorest and most oppressed areas in the world. If they have one meal per day, I think that's, that would be a big deal. And we're talking about facing one of the best armed, and I've said this before, best trained, best financed, and perhaps best fed militaries in the world, which is, of course, the Israeli military, which you may have heard me say before, I refer to as nothing more than a glamorized terrorist organization. And then the vengeance began. Israel was humiliated, the Israeli army and so on were humiliated, and the only thing that they could do is what a gangster does when a gangster is humiliated, and that is take out their vengeance against the poorest, weakest, most defenseless victim they can find. And over the last month and a half or so, we've been seeing the bodies pile up, bodies of innocent Palestinian civilians, and it hasn't ended. And I'm sure you know this, the conservative estimate so far is 20,000 dead Palestinian civilians. What we're hearing is that the more realistic numbers, once all those that are missing are found, and I don't want to get too detailed here, but once those who were burnt and buried under the rubble are found, it would be closer to 50,000, which is unparalleled even for the savagery we've seen over the last 75 years by the state of Israel. But that's what happens when a gangster, and that's precisely what the state of Israel is humiliated, and that's exactly what happened. Now, the biggest problem, I believe, so far has been that what was clearly a military success by Palestinian fighters. And I don't think I'm saying anything here that others haven't said before. I mean, even Israeli generals were praising, as the first days after this, the first days of the fighting was taking place, Israeli generals were praising the Palestinian success. And by the way, they also took over a military base, the main military base of what's known as the Gaza Brigade, which is an Israeli military brigade that's supposed to prevent what happened on October the 7th, and was nowhere to be found. And so the problem is that military success was never translated into a political accomplishment, because that's the whole point of a military operation at the end of the day. And the world is not standing with Palestinians. This is nothing new. Palestinians are orphans. We know that. The Palestinian issue is an orphan. Nobody speaks for Palestine. There's nobody standing up for Palestine. Nobody making demands for Palestine. And so this success that we saw has not, at least not yet, been translated into any real political gain for Palestinians. And what we're seeing now, even as we sit here, the bodies are still piling up, and the fighting is still going on. In other words, even with this enormous savagery, this enormous brutality of killing so many civilians, the Israeli military is still fighting Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli military is suffering very serious casualties. It's very interesting. Usually, when you read the Israeli press, they tell you how many were killed and who was killed and so on in terms of the military. And now they're being very vague about it. Every few days they put up a few names. But they're not advertising the actual numbers, which is rare. But you can tell officers are being killed, commanders of special units are being killed, and so on. So they're facing a very difficult time, even now, even after all this time, in the fighting in the Gaza Strip. And I'll say one more thing, which is that, as far as I've heard, the declared objective of the Palestinian mission was to take as many hostages as possible and then negotiate a release of Palestinian prisoners. Some 6,000 Palestinians are held in Israeli jails. The Israeli military, the declared objective of the Israeli military is to eradicate Hamas, which is this very vague, and I don't think anybody possibly takes it seriously, objective, which really means nothing. So there's really no strategy, there's no real objective, but piling up the numbers of Palestinians is good for internal Israeli politics, and so they're going to continue to do that unless someone at some point forces them to stop.
Miko, you've said that correctly that the Palestinians are orphans in the world scene, that no government is coming to their assistance, no Arab government, no Western power, and none of the rest of the world is taking any action at all to stop the killing. However, what we're seeing it from our own government here, is they're trying to get away from any responsibility for what's happening. Our own Foreign Minister Penny Wong said that she wasn't able to judge from afar the rightness of denying food and water to the people of Gaza. These sort of incredible statements are becoming the norm, it seems, with Western governments, but they're also increasingly hiding behind the resurrected notion of the two-state solution, that this destruction of Hamas will somehow open the way to a new peace process and a two-state solution, which leaves us asking, how realistic is that?
Well, like I said earlier, the elimination of any particular Palestinian group is not realistic at all. I don't think anybody thinks it's realistic, but it's a good slogan. And the two-state solution is not realistic, but it's a good slogan. It's never been realistic. The two-state solution has always been a myth. And in order for the two-state solution to have materialized, at least at some point, the state of Israel would have had to agree to it. And the state of Israel, for decades, has made it absolutely clear, consecutive governments have made it absolutely clear, that not only do they not want this to happen, but they actually created a reality on the ground which made it impossible. So the two-state solution is a myth, and I'll share a quick story with you. On the 5th day of the 1967 war, which was the last day of the war, people call it the 6-day war, but it was actually a 5-day war. Anybody know why they called it a 6-day war? Anybody who's ever opened the Jewish prayer book, the term 6 days, 6 days, 6 days of creation, the miracle of 6 days of creation, and they wanted people to think that there was a miracle. And they succeeded. Many people still to this day ask me if I don't believe it was a miracle. There was no miracle. It was a brutal assault by Israel against its neighbors in order to take land, which they did. So on that very last day of the war, when the Israeli military high command met, my father was a member of the Israeli high command, and he stood up and he said, well, now we have an opportunity to make peace with our neighbors. We can allow the Palestinians to establish their own state in the West Bank and Gaza, these newly occupied territories. We have all these territories where we can negotiate a peace with the Egyptians and the Syrians and move on. Now, as he was saying these words, two things were taking place. The first thing is that Israeli bulldozers were destroying Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and Palestinian villages and towns within the West Bank. And they were building heavily for Jews only in these newly occupied territories. The second thing that was happening is my father's comrades took him aside and said, "You're out of your mind. We just took our land, this land that we believe is ours. Why in the world would we ever negotiate with the Arabs? Why do we need peace? I mean, what's the objective? Peace has never been a declared objective of the Israeli state." And so, from that moment on, Israel did everything it possibly could so that there would never be two states between the river and the sea. Is it permitted to say between the river and the sea in Australia? Because in the United States, there are people who seem to think that saying between the river and the sea is problematic. But anyway, so Israel made it clear that Israel established a single state on all of historic Palestine. It's called the State of Israel. It's the apartheid state of Israel. It's a state where I have privilege at the expense of Palestinians. But God forbid that Palestinians will demand a single state over all of historic Palestine. The difference between these two demands, by the way, one calls for the exclusive rights for people like myself, Jewish people. The other calls for equal rights and the possibility of peace between Israelis and Palestinians. That's the difference between the two, which is why the Zionists are so afraid of the possibility of the Palestinian version of the single state ever materializing. And that is really what this is all about. It's not Arabs or Palestinians versus Jews and Israelis. It has nothing to do with it. Because the Palestinian call for a single democracy with equal rights on historic Palestine includes equal rights, which is the only way we will ever achieve peace between Israelis and Palestinians. The Zionist call for a greater Israel is just an apartheid state, as we've seen, that is extremely violent and brutal. So the governments today around the world, and it's not only the West, and it's not only the Arab states, it's around the world, it's in Africa, it's India, it's the BRICS alliance, and everybody else, they do not want to pick a side here. They don't want to say, yes, we support justice and equality, and they certainly don't want to say that they support apartheid, which they do, of course. So they say, well, let's talk about the two-state solution. Because it's safe, it's never going to happen, and you don't have to do anything to make it happen. I mean, there's nothing you can possibly do to make it happen, so it's a safe thing to fall back onto.
I think people who have been suspicious or sceptical of the two-state solution for a long time, it has become increasingly obvious that it wasn't going to happen. After the killing stops, we hope that will be soon. People are looking to see what they should be supporting in terms of strategies or campaigns to change the reality in Palestine. A two-state solution isn't going to be brought about by governments or by the UN. What should people be looking at? What will bring about change, in your view, from the river to the sea?
Well, I don't even know what the virtue of the two-state solution is, so I can't speak to that. I mean, it's not something worth discussing because, again, like I said, it's a myth that has no chance of ever materializing. What to expect? I don't think we can expect anything good to happen unless there is a major change, and the major change is not going to happen on its own. Let's assume for a minute that in the United States there are politicians who want to make the right decision. And the reason I bring up the United States is because that is the, American foreign policy is the foreign policy that Australians follow, the Europeans follow, and this is kind of, they point the way. But let's assume for a minute that there are politicians in the United States who want to make an informed decision. They don't have the possibility to do that because all they're ever presented with is one side of the story. The Zionists have, for the last 100 years, been presenting a very compelling story. And they've been pushing it very, very hard. They've established a very, very well-funded, well-organized strategic campaign of public relations to that end, to pursue their objectives and to make sure that this particular, like I said, very compelling story is presented, and presented, every single day, every single moment. There's no one presenting the other side. The other side is absent. There is no one. There is no parallel on the Palestinian side. It's not happening. Now, I just happen to be involved in an initiative in Washington, D.C., which is where I live, to create that presence in Washington, D.C. And anybody here who speaks Arabic, we're calling it Dar al-Hurriya, which we hope will be an actual space in Washington, D.C. that will do just that. But of course, that requires funding, that requires organizing, that requires a great deal of work. And so, in the absence of that, we're going to keep seeing what we've been seeing, which is countries around the world just blindly following America, America blindly following Israel on this issue, and Palestinians being killed wholesale. It's not going to end on its own. It's only going to end if we initiate. And as individuals, or even as small organizations, because small organizations like this one exist everywhere, we're not capable of competing. It's not going to happen. So again, that's why I and several others are working on this initiative in Washington, D.C. We formed a nonprofit and so on, and we're hoping to get some funding and get this thing going. Otherwise, we're not going to see change. There's no reason to expect anything different will happen in Palestine unless countries around the world and the international community demand immediate and severe sanctions against the state of Israel. Until there's this demand for a no-fly zone over Gaza, until billions of dollars are invested to rebuild Gaza and rehabilitate the destruction and the people, give them the basic needs that they need to recover from the savagery that they've been subjected to, and begin steps to dismantle the apartheid state, the apartheid regime. Until the apartheid regime is dismantled, it's brought on its knees and forced to give up power, we're not going to see anything change in Palestine. So these sounds like big, lofty goals, big goals. But the thing is, this is the opportunity to do that. Palestinians how much more courage and how much more sacrifice do Palestinians need to demonstrate before the world wakes up? How much more? I'm really asking. 50,000 dead is not enough. How much more? Because obviously Palestinians are capable of great sacrifice, and Palestinians are also capable of great courage. But how long? And how much? How much more do they have to pay before people wake up and pay attention?
You've spoken before of your belief that there's two requirements to bring about the sort of change you're talking about there. One is a movement like the BDS movement, and the other is a clear and consistent message from the other side, the anti-Zionist side. Can you elaborate on those two things?
Yes, well, I'll start with the second one. The message has to be uniform and unified. And it's very interesting that people say, well, Palestinians are divided, Palestinians don't really know what they want, Palestinians are not sure, they don't have leadership. I've never met a single Palestinian who does not want to see all of Palestine free. Never, not one. So I don't think there's any question that there's a unity in purpose. Palestinians Palestinians are like prisoners in a maximum security prison. To expect that under those conditions, where one person can't travel from one part of their own country to another part of their own country, from city to city freely, that they would be able to come up with some kind of a unified leadership and a unified strategy to accomplish this goal is absurd. It's impossible. They are in a prison. We are the ones that can help. We need to be the ones who will help the Palestinians. We are the ones that need to push the governments that we elect, by the way, and the representatives that we vote for, by the way, to stop supporting racism, to stop supporting violence in Palestine, and to start supporting the possibility of peace and justice, which of course will only come as a result of freedom and justice. And so I think it's important to start speaking like we mean it. A free, democratic Palestine on all of historic Palestine is the call of the day. That is it. There's nothing else. The only other option is what we're seeing so far, which is death and destruction for Palestinians. There has to be an absolute clear demand to safeguard, to provide guarantees for the safety and security of Palestinians. Palestinian life is cheap. You can kill a Palestinian anywhere in Palestine and nothing happens. There's no recourse. Palestinian parents have no recourse when their children are being killed, when their homes are being demolished, when they're being thrown in prison. And by the way, since October 7, Israel doubled the number of prisoners. Doubled it. They went from 6,000 to almost 12,000. And so nobody speaks to their rights. Nobody speaks to guaranteeing their safety and security. So these messages have to be very, very clear, and the method, I believe, or one of the, we know one of the most effective methods to do this is to demand sanctions, is to demand divestment, and is to demand a boycott. And the boycott, it's not just about not buying an Israeli product. Boycott means, I'll tell you a story rather than maybe tell you. Some of you may remember in the Tokyo Olympics in 2021, there was a young Algerian athlete by the name of Fathi Nourin, and he was a competitor in judo. And you can imagine how hard a young person has to work to get to the Olympics. I mean, it's a lifelong endeavor, right? He was 21, 22, and when he was called up to compete against a member of the Israeli team, he drew a line and he said, no. He threw away his career. He threw away his career. He was kicked out of the Olympics, and he was kicked out of the International Judo Federation, which means he cannot participate in that sport ever. Or maybe they said 10 years or something, but which basically means his career is over. Now, he did the right thing, but it shouldn't be up to him. He shouldn't be the one having to sacrifice his career. The Olympic Committee should not allow an Israeli team to participate. It shouldn't be up to the individual athletes to sacrifice themselves, And so, of course, he went back to Algeria and he's a hero. But it's not right for us to demand of him to do that, or other young people, or for that sake, for young Palestinians to be the ones having to face the Israeli military. The fact that they have to do it is our failure. The Israeli military should not be. There should be an absolute boycott on the possibility of selling weapons to Israel. Selling weapons to Israel? Think about this for a minute.
Yeah.
What kind of horrific thing is, who can do something like that? Especially with this long history. So these are the messages, and these are the kinds, and of course, calling for boycott, calling for divestment. There should be no Israeli representation in any arena, not just in athletic sporting arenas, but cultural arenas, academic arenas, and certainly diplomatic arenas. Israel should be a pariah. And we are the only ones who can do this. We're the only ones who can do this. We vote for the politicians. We vote for the governments that we have. And so we need to make it clear to them that there should be zero tolerance to any kind of racism and violence, zero tolerance to Zionism.
Many of Israel's supporters say that the problem is the current Israeli government, that they're extreme in their nationalism and they're giving free rein to extremist settlers. Is there a peace camp in Israel? Is there a moderate Israel?
No. There's no moderate Israel. There's no moderate Zionism. There's no liberal Zionism. People may like to call themselves that, but that does not exist. And this particular government, in all honesty, I don't see how this government is different than any other Israeli government in the past. we have seen governments over the last 75 years. People like to forget that Israel was established on the ashes of a destroyed Palestine with over close to 1 million people displaced, and God only knows how many were massacred in the process in 1948. So it's very convenient to say, well, yes, this particular government is extremist. This particular government is no more extremist than every other government that ever existed in the history of the State of Israel. It's just that the faces are different, maybe the rhetoric is slightly different, but in terms of their actions and in terms of their statements and their stated goals, they're no different than any other Israeli government. So it's important not to be fooled by this notion that there could be this, pie in the sky, liberal, friendly, peace-loving Israel. That does not exist, and it cannot exist.
Is there an awareness within Israel of these realities? Are people deluding themselves, or do they not see the options?
Well, I think I don't know the answer to that. The reality, when you grow up as an Israeli, you don't see Palestinians. They don't exist. I mean, the effectiveness of the segregation that has been imposed on Palestine from the very beginning is remarkable. Israelis, I grew up in Jerusalem, which was, by the time I was growing up, it was already East and West Jerusalem. East Jerusalem was already occupied as well. And so it was what they call a mixed city. I never saw Palestinians growing up. Palestinian kids are never, the segregation is absolute. We see that they live differently, and we know that they live differently, and but we don't enter their spaces, and we don't know anything about them. And the assumption is that the reason Palestinians live in these conditions that are so far different than our conditions is because there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
It's because they are incapable of what we are capable, and therefore they live in these conditions. So Israelis live in this, the whole Israel is a bubble that has been created inside Palestine in which Israelis live. It's a bubble. It's a bubble of privilege. And again, like I said, it's a small country. To create that kind of effective segregation between two communities that sometimes live across the street from each other, is incredible. But I think Israelis are delusional. There's no question about that. They've been hit very, very hard on October the 7th. I think they realize now that they are a lot more vulnerable than they ever thought they were. But, on the other hand, what do you expect? How much longer can this injustice continue? How much longer can Israelis enjoy, for example, if we're talking about the Nakab, the southern part of Palestine, which is mostly the part that, is closer to the Gaza Strip, Israel enjoys some of the highest standards of living in the settlements in the Nakab. Palestinians, now the Nakab has 300,000 Palestinian Bedouins who are citizens of Israel. They are the poorest of the poor among the citizens of Israel. So you've got the wealthiest of the wealthiest and the poorest of the poor living across the street from each other, and then just a few kilometers away you have the Gaza Strip, and nobody even talks about it. Nobody even talks about what is happening in the Gaza Strip. From time to time people will say, why is it so crowded? Why are they so poor? But there's no consideration given to that. So, what do they expect?
You're happy to take a few questions?
Yeah.
I'll bring the microphone around if people want to raise their hand. I'd like to ask a question. Maybe I'll go that way.
Obviously our political context in Australia is a bit different from America. There's obviously some cultural overlaps here and there, but we have different political systems. What are the kind of, as Australians, as people living in Australia, what are some of the actions you think are most effective for the kind of movements we're in? And what should be the demands for our government in particular? Like, what should we be asking them to divest from? What are some concrete political demands that you see the average Australian could say to their government if they support Palestine?
Can I have a piece of paper? I think what we'll do, let's take 3 questions at a time. Let's take 3 questions at a time, and I'll just need a piece of paper so I can write them down.
Yeah.
So, welcome to South Australia. There are similar issues happening with the Tibetans and the Uyghur people in China that I've been working through with Amnesty International, and I was a little bit heartened by Human Rights Watch USA, who has been watching Israeli movements, documenting Israeli abuses and savagery, and has indicted Netanyahu and Gaza. Now, how real is that? How true is that?
How true is what? I don't understand.
Indictment.
This is indicted.
Human Rights Watch USA has indicted. And although Netanyahu said last week, I won't go, stuff them, I won't go, the International Court has said, well, we will proceed because we have so much documentation from Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Save the Children.
Third question.
There's someone at the front.
Maybe I'll get slowed down.
Is it true that the evangelical movement within America has a huge impact on Israel and the funding? Because I was actually raised as a born-again evangelical Christian and converted to Islam 10 years ago, but I found that my Christian friends, my Christian family are very silent, and I know that when I was in church years ago there was this push for, I don't know if you're familiar with the verses, when the fig tree flourishes and the vine beareth fruit, that Jesus or Isa will return. And so the evangelicals are trying to twist the arm of God by establishing the fig tree and the vine. And is that something that is a huge problem in America? And it's spreading throughout the world because the evangelists come and they preach the same hatred too.
Thank you.
Let's do one more question. You've got a loud voice.
Oh yeah. Yes. Sometimes with the pro-Israel side, there's politicians. There's weaponizing anti-Semitism. There's a lot of components that come in and probably in a way or another make me, for example, as a Palestinian, hesitant to stand up and say free Palestine or something like that. What would you say to people like me, who would be hesitant to stand up and say something when politicians stand up and say something like, if you stand, we'll deport people that do that. Anti-Semitism, so on and forth.
I think I'll start with that question, if you don't mind, and then go from there. I think that's a key issue, and it's very interesting. I realized just yesterday, I gave another talk last night, and what I realized was it doesn't matter if I'm on a campus in the U.S. or if I'm here in Adelaide. The other side has the exact same playbook, and they had it immediately. The exact same questions, the exact same accusations, the exact same statements immediately. And that's precisely what we lack. When I was talking about the playbook, when I was talking about having the well-funded strategic, way to present the case, that's exactly what I'm talking about. So this question that you raised right now is an issue everywhere. And it became an issue immediately everywhere. And the effectiveness of the other side is really dazzling. It's really incredible. Now, they've been weaponizing anti-Semitism. It's nothing new. They've been doing this for a very long time and accusing anyone who rejects Zionism of anti-Semitism, even if these are Jewish people. Even Jewish people who have rejected Zionism and have been rejecting Zionism since the very beginning are either bad Jews or somehow anti-Semitic. And what's really unbelievable is that people buy into this.
That's right.
That people buy into this, that if somehow you reject racism and violence, you yourself are anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
How does anybody buy into this nonsense? Why are people even willing to accept this nonsense? Because anti-Semitism is a form of racism. So if you oppose racism, you are a racist? I mean, think about this for a second, but this is how they present it. And then I know that this new definition of anti-Semitism has been presented here in Australia too. You know, it's caught like wildfire, you know, because they had to make sure that rejecting Zionism, rejecting Israel is somehow anti-Semitic, and that was their key, and they were very successful in that. So what I would say is this, maybe two things. First of all, they're very good at cornering people who are Palestinians or support the cause of justice in Palestine, and to putting us on the defensive. Well, I think that we have to change that dynamic. Palestinians have nothing to apologize for. Nothing. Palestinians have nothing that they need to explain. Nothing. The other side, on the other hand, needs to explain 20,000 bodies of innocent civilians. And until they explain that, they need to sit down and shut up. That's it. And that's the end of the conversation. And that's the end of now. The fear of expressing yourself is real. I know that, and I know for Palestinians particularly, and Muslims particularly, this is a very serious challenge. But the only way to confront it is to confront it. As far as I can see, the only way to confront it is to confront it. We have on our side one thing that they will never have. Thank you. The truth. We're telling the truth. We don't have to make up lies. What we say is based in truth. It's based in history. It's based in reality. It's not based on a fairy tale. And so we need to learn how to use that. Now, granted, they come with a playbook, so all they have to do is open to page 13, and they know exactly what to say when you say this. Well, they know how to attack. Well, they need to sit down and they need to answer a few questions first. Before any Palestinian has to condemn anyone, they need to show that they are condemning 75 years of oppression and murder. Then we can talk. And they won't. They won't. They can't. And if you present it like that, just like any bully, if you push back, they retreat. And that's at least that's what I've been seeing. And again, the only way to confront a bully like that is to confront them, you know, and to stand firm. And remember that as Palestinians and as people who support the call for justice in Palestine, we have nothing to apologize for, nothing to explain, and we need to condemn no one. Absolutely no one. The call for Palestinians to condemn, or for people who support Palestine to condemn anything, is absolutely ludicrous. There's nothing to condemn. The question about the evangelicals, a lot of people don't know this, but the whole idea of Zionism is an evangelical idea. It preceded the Jews becoming, creating the Zionist movement. And so, of course, there's this great relationship between the two, and today the evangelical movement, it's called Christians United for Israel. They are in terms of money, they are the biggest supporters of Israel in the United States, in terms of money. And Israel is quite happy to collaborate with them on that, even though they don't take it seriously. I think ideologically, certainly. And we've seen, everybody here, I'm sure you've seen how Israel treats Christians when they come to the Holy Land. So, but that is the reality, and yes, they are a very, very strong influence, certainly in the United States. I'm not sure about I don't know really about the Human Rights Watch indicting Netanyahu, but Netanyahu is already indicted for for corruption. And the international law, the international courts move very, very slow. So ideally, once Palestine is free, these people all line up and go to court and end up going to jail. But it's a very, very long process. I would hate to have to wait for that. In terms of what Australians can do, obviously there are nuances and there are differences between the political systems. At the same time, Australians vote for a representative, right? They vote for the representative in Parliament. They need your votes. Members of the government need your votes. Well, if we are going to give them our votes, then it's important that we make our conditions clear. Today, in any Western democracy, there is this claim that there should be zero tolerance to racism, right? Well, prove it. You can't say zero tolerance to racism and then support Israel and say that you're a Zionist. But we are the ones that have to make it clear. They're not going to do that on their own. So that would be my suggestion.
We have the microphone. Somebody, I think you were next.
back to us.
Do you have the microphone?
سلام.
أهلا وسهلا بكم. يعني نحن نرحب بكم ونشكركم على حضوركم. أرجو من أفضل يترجم السؤال.
Yeah, but everybody wants to hear.
أنت ذكرت مسألة مهمة في حديثك عن الفرق بين الصهيونية واليهودية، وهذا شيء مهم طبعا كمجتمعات يجب أن تفهم هذا الأمر. ونحن كمسلمين أصلا في ديننا هذا الأمر واضح جدا، فاليهودية هي إحدى الشرائع التي يجب الإيمان بها وإيمان برسولها موسى عليه السلام حتى يثبت الإيمان. ولكن نحن نريد أن نقول من نسبة 15 أو 16 مليون يهودي في العالم، نسمع أصوات كثيرة معارضة للحركة الصهيونية التي بدأت في بدايات القرن العشرين، ونسمع عن الحركة الصهيونية التي اليوم تمسك الإعلام. اليوم الإعلام بيد الحركة الصهيونية التي اليوم هي تقود الحرب، حرب الإبادة ضد فلسطين وغزة والكثير من بقاع الأرض، وتتحكم بالقرار الإعلامي والمالي الاقتصادي. ما أريد أن يعني أعرفه من هذه الملايين 16 التي ربما نختلف أو يختلف البعض عن عدد هذه الملايين في العالم، كم هم المعارضين من اليهود للحركة الصهيونية؟ لأنه مهم جدا أن نعرف حركة المعارضة اليهودية للحركة الصهيونية، لأن هناك أصوات كثيرة نسمعها في العالم وفي الإعلام في هذا المجال. جزاكم الله خيرا.
Alright, try to translate quickly. The Imam first welcomed our guest and thank him for his attendance, and talked and thank him for the point talking about the difference between Zionism and Judaism. And as Muslims, in our belief in the Quran, that we believe as a Muslim you can't be a believer without believing in Moses as a prophet of God. And so the idea is emphasizing that difference between Judaism and Zionism is very important. The question comes, we know as an estimate that we have about 15-16 million Jews around the world, and we've seen many opposing the Zionism and Israel. And unfortunately the Zionists, they have a strong hold and control of the media in the West. So how strong is the opposition from the Jewish people in the West to the Israel and Zionists from your knowledge? Thank you.
So this is, thank you, Imam, for the question. This is an important point to clarify. Jew is a religion. Zionism is a racist ideology. There's no connection between the two. And in the year 1900, Zionism was just in its infancy. Some of the most important rabbis in the world put out a book. Now, 1900, this is before World War II. There were millions of Jews in Europe. There were Jews in Arab countries. And this book was a warning to Jewish people about the dangers of Zionism. The year 1900. And basically, they said three things.
What's the name of the book?
It was written in Hebrew. So it's gonna do any good. If I had to translate it's something like light to the wise. Light to the people who are wise. The first thing they said is that Zionism will bring violence to the Holy Land. Check. The second thing they said is Zionism will destroy the good relations that exist between Jews and Muslims and Jews and Arabs around the world. Check. And the third thing they said is that it will cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jewish people who live around the world as religious minorities. Again, check. In 1900 they saw this. They already predicted this would happen. And ever since then there have been large Jewish communities, particularly the very ultra-Orthodox ones, who have rejected Zionism, and the community in Jerusalem still rejects the state of Israel. And then there are other non-practicing Jewish people who also reject Zionism. So I don't know what the numbers are. And like the Imam said, the Zionists have the loudest voices. They have the big megaphones. They're out there. They have very strong influence everywhere. They've worked very, very hard to have this influence in the media, in politics, in culture, in philanthropy, in every area of life. They have created influence, and they do it very skillfully. Now, I don't know that anybody knows exactly what the numbers are, but the distinction is really important to understand. And in Palestine, there's this mantra that you hear from kids who are 4 years old until adults who are 84 years old. There is no conflict between Muslims and Jews. There is no conflict between Arabs and Jews. It's Zionism, it's the occupation, it's the racism. That is the problem. And that is true, but then somehow that voice never comes out beyond that. So I think it's important to understand Zionism is not a reflection of Judaism. It is the antithesis of Judaism. It's you know what I mean? According to Jewish law, Zionism is a crime.